All right, welcome to Rev Reads. I am really excited about the show that we're going to have today. We have a great collection of three authors who just came together to deliver us a new book entitled Discovering Dispensationalism. This book's going to go down as one of my favorites for the year. Not only is this a quality work looking at the history of dispensational thought, but it also comes about at a really great time, as we have a couple of other books that are coming out this year that are talking about the pitfalls, the shortcomings of dispensationalism, maybe even the end of dispensationalism. And so this book helps us know that this is not the end, but we still have more scholarship to deliver from this point of view, and also points back to what's been in dispensationalism before. So I want to thank those who are joining me today in this interview. I want to thank James Fazio, Cory Marsh, and Tommy Ice. So thank you guys for coming and being on Rev Reads.
Dispensationalism is going to end with the rapture.
Let's end right there. Thank you, Shawn, for having us on. Really appreciate it.
Yes.
And enjoy Rev Reads podcast. You do some excellent reviews, so it's always enjoyable to watch. And thank you for having us on.
Yeah, so this is the second time I've had James and Cory. Oh, Cory, this is your third time on Rev Reads.
Okay.
Because you were on for the Forged from Reformation book.
All right.
And then we did your, there it is, Biblical Literacy primer. And now you're on for Discovering Dispensationalism. And Cory, I think you're the first 3-time guest on the channel. So give you a little gold medal for that.
I'll take that as a huge compliment, because usually it takes me one time on a podcast and they never want me back. So, hey, I got 3 times, or that speaks really lowly to your standards, one of the two.
Well, normally I might say that, but James, thanks for coming on the second time. I appreciate it. And Dr. Tommy Ice, I'm just thrilled that you're on here today. And as soon as Cory said you were going to come on and be on for this interview, I was just thrilled to have you on. So just thank you so much for coming and being on the channel.
I just hope I don't have a meltdown.
No, we'll get right to it.
So we can watch it.
Yeah. So I think the first question that's got to come up when it comes to discovering dispensationalism is that what this book is doing is tracing through dispensational thoughts or ideas that have been present from the New Testament period all the way up to today. And so this is what are things that are considered dispensational today that have been present throughout the church age. So I think we need to start with saying, what are dispensational thoughts? What are those ideas that we would say would be uniquely part of the dispensational system? So can you guys let us know, what were your deciding lines for what are dispensational thoughts?
James, you want to go first? Or?
Sure. Yeah. It's right out the doors. We need to identify it's a bit anachronistic. Where dispensationalism is as a term and as a system of theology as it's been used over the last few centuries. It has become defined by several features, which are very, very obvious. We could all kind of talk about the organization of biblical history around a divine perspective, how God has arranged his programs with the various peoples of God, and the recognition of differing peoples of God. Charles Ryrie reduced it to a very simple level of a distinction between Israel and the church. It's obviously more than that, but because we're the ones asking the questions, the church, we need to begin with the most fundamental distinction, that we are not Israel. And that in itself is a large and defining statement for many Christians. That does drive a line in the sand. And so at the risk of being too reductionistic, it is a clear card you're carrying, either to say we have replaced Israel, or that God has one continuous plan that he has worked through various iterations, or a recognition of, Jesus has mentioned, John cited in chapter 10 of, I have other sheep that are not of this fold. The suggestion that God has different folds that he's working with, and he has different programs for each of those. So that, obviously, there's the eschatological issue and other distinctive features, the pre-trib rapture. I mean, all of these are core for dispensational understanding. as it's understood today. So as we look back throughout history, we say, where did these themes emerge, whether it be the distinction of peoples, whether it be the eschatology, whether it be, how God's dealing with the church uniquely. I mean, each of these end up becoming kind of hallmark features for recognizing dispensational thought in the history of the centuries of the church.
Yeah, Cory, there's not much I would add to what James said. That was beautiful. I would say, if anything, just to reiterate the idea of what the book is not doing is trying to prove that the system of dispensationalism has been since the first century on. We very intently use the word dispensational thought as you form the question, Shawn, and it's right there in the subtitle as well, just like a previous book, Forged from Reformation. How dispensational thought advances the Reformed legacy. Well, it's in the subtitle of this as well, tracing the development of dispensational thought. So we're talking about ideas and themes, distinctions, not the system itself. Now, the Bible, let's call it the second Bible, this book, right? Just kidding. This book does, by the end, get to the system of dispensationalism toward the end. When we get into the actual branching off in dispensational thought in modern America, then you see how the system takes on wheels and forms around different distinctions and becomes an actual system, perhaps in the late 1900s, but certainly leading into the 20th century, it goes into a full orb system. But up until then, these are ideas. So we are demonstrating the thought patterns, the patterns of belief that are distinct. They're not all everybody held to every one of these, but you see these themes, whether it's a distinction between church and Israel, a literal hermeneutic, which we would today perhaps call a grammatical historical hermeneutic, the distinction between the church and the kingdom, a future for God's people, Israel, being not just a mass salvation of Jewish people, but an actual national restoration, to various rapture positions, which include what we would today call a pre-trib rapture. These are ideas that have been throughout church history. They weren't novel. They're not cultic. They weren't invented in the mind of somebody in the 19th century. And so we're doing our best to demonstrate that dispensational thought, these ideas and themes, have been present throughout church history.
Tom, do you have any other additional thoughts on how what you would consider to be a dispensational idea? Anything that you might want to add to that?
Well, the early church was totally premillennial. Not totally, but almost totally as far as recorded people go. And you then have the shift coming out of North Africa totally away from, consistent hermeneutics. Now, all of the early premillennialists were not consistent, certainly in applying, their hermeneutic and everything, but they believed that because it was such a strong tradition in the early church, that is premillennialism. And right off the bat, though, you see the early church being influenced by Judaism more than the New Testament epistles, in my opinion, which is why you have the setup and arrangements that led to the Middle Ages and all of this kind of stuff. And it wasn't until Augustine, and I forget the guy before that he got this idea from, that you have viewing premillennialism as a heresy. And for 1100 years, it was illegal in the church to state clearly premillennial view. And so it wasn't until the early 1600s that you begin to have some people that began to teach pre-tribulationalism. And we have, my organization, the Pre-Trib Study Group, has people that are going back and reading the 500 volumes of church history in Latin and Greek that are not in those 3 volumes of English translations. And we're up to over 60 pre-trib statements coming from even some amillennialists in early church history teaching a pre-trib rapture of some kind. And this is kind of revolutionary. And we realize that the problem in the past was that people who weren't pre-tribulational did not go back and look at a lot of this information. But we're finding that the idea of a pre-trib rapture, for example, has been taught amazingly as early as the 100s in church history.
Yeah, so again, what this book is proving is not that you can find dispensationalism in all these areas, but we just listed all these various ideas and thought patterns that are consistent with dispensationalism. Probably the only one that's mentioned a bunch in the book that you guys didn't mention that I would, that I would add is just a future perspective of revelation, that you have a literal antichrist, that those events and judgments will occur that way. That's mentioned several times in the book, and I think that's another distinctive of dispensationalism. A great list there. And one of the things I loved in the book is your chapter, James, on the New Testament and how that sort of lays the groundwork for our dispensational thought. And I'd love for you to share a little bit on how Jesus's parables prepare us to be dispensationalists.
It's interesting. Thank you for that, Shawn. I'm glad that you found that helpful. When you look at Jesus's teachings, there is no question that he taught on oikonomia. He introduced the very word economy, stewardship. He used that in his teachings far more than he did covenants or so many other features that we place a great prominence on. This did not seem to feature nearly as centrally in his mindset as he was teaching his disciples as stewardship. The fact that a steward would be called to give an account. These are critical features, that the stewards are given something, a administration over something that is not their own, that belongs to another, a greater, and that they need to steward and ultimately will be held accountable for their stewardship with the goods that was entrusted to them over the household that they were appointed. So these features Luke brings out with great clarity in his gospel, and it's interesting how much the same features carry over into Paul's epistles as well. So there seems to be a shared idea around what it means to be a steward, to be entrusted something by God, to be held accountable for the management of something. And these are all central features. We don't hear a lot about this in dispensationalism today. So I think it's important to bring that out because, a lot of times, again, we get down to a much more reductionistic level of, as you mentioned, just a futurist perspective on eschatology. In fact, so many things boil down to eschatology because it's an easy identifier, to be able to say, are you awaiting a future return of Christ, a restoration of Israel, a rapture of the church prior to a great tribulation? These kinds of issues are really easy to call attention to and create a dividing line. But when you look at a sort of a total understanding of what God has entrusted to his people, looking back on biblical history, what he communicated to Abraham and to Israel, to the prophets, to the disciples, and the work that carried on throughout the epistles, you see a framework of stewardship playing a very central part. I mean, it goes all the way back to Genesis, and Paul had this same framework, no less, to apply to himself theologically. When you get to the Epistle of Ephesians, Paul shared this concept. It comes out so clear in chapter 3 when he says, identifies himself as a steward of the dispensation of the grace of God. It was entrusted to him, and it was for the Gentiles. And so you see every single one of those features that Jesus referred to in Luke. It becomes very evident that there is a shared mindset around the concept of dispensations that is very foreign to us. It's just very foreign because we don't use that kind of terminology. The word itself sometimes is translated in a variety of English words that many cases doesn't retain either the word dispensation or administration or economy or anything. And sometimes that's motivated by the translating committee, or it's motivated by other reasons to simply not retain the word or the concept, or just a failure to identify how this language featured into the understanding of the first century writers. But it's essential, and it certainly informed, I believe, that it informed Darby's understanding, certainly those before him as well, but for those who were really interested in that level of study, the level of exegetical work that Darby did in the Greek New Testament and in the mind and the philosophy of the Greeks, his familiarity with his concept, I think, certainly informed his nuance in what a dispensation is. And again, I think it's maybe gotten quite a bit watered down. Maybe we'll talk about that later, in terms of different iterations of dispensational thinkers. And sometimes much of that is not retained, but I think at a foundational level, it is essential. It's essential for having more than a merely successive idea of history or a futurist idea of the return of Christ, but a full arrangement of how God holds mankind according to his programs or his sheepfolds, how he holds them responsible for that which he has entrusted to them.
Yeah, no, and I love that whole section of the book and how it started right off with it, because I think a lot of people, they hear the word dispensationalism and they're just like, that's not something from the Bible. They just think that just sounds so foreign. And what you show both through Jesus's parables and through Paul in Ephesians 3:2, thank you for covering the next question out of the ones I listed to you and your answer to that one. But the language in Ephesians 3 and Jesus's parables really just, you should set our minds to be ready for what dispensationalism brings to the table. I think it lays it all out to show this is a biblical way of that the scriptures present the own way that God deals with his creation. So it's just a great way to lay it out. And so I appreciate that chapter. So I think this makes sense, and this is how we should approach things. But the question is, where did dispensationalism go wrong? Because I think if you look at your answer, James, and you look at what you said about Darby and the way that he was really digging into the truth, this seems very intellectual to me, like a very logical way to look at the scriptures. But somehow dispensationalism, at least how it's viewed in our society by large, is viewed as anti-intellectual. It's viewed as escapism. So, Cory, could you speak for a little bit on where you think dispensationalism went wrong in becoming suddenly anti-intellectual and escapism in the way that it's viewed by culture at large?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would probably answer that in two different ways. One is because dispensationalism is at root a hermeneutical movement that is based on a specific interpretive method, what we would say is a consistent literal method or grammatical historical method. It's going to lend itself more naturally to people that aren't as educated to be able to understand the scripture, as well as those who are educated, right? So because it's based on this idea that God revealed himself in the Bible, it is clear, and he expects us to understand it. Then whether you're 5 years old or 105 years old, you should be expected to understand at least the majority of it, just using a proper interpretive method that is looking for the intended meaning of the text. So that lends itself quite naturally to those who don't. It doesn't require degrees, right? A PhD to figure this out, but it does provide enough excitement to be able to understand the text, to delve into, to be able to become intellectually, to create academic projects that are based on the Bible. That's what's so fantastic about a literal hermeneutic, that it's welcoming to everybody. But to your question, maybe I'm thinking on the cultural side, where did dispensationalism go wrong? I don't think dispensationalism has ever gone wrong. I think certain dispensationalists, have gone wrong, right, perhaps. Maybe more the fringe side, but there's no doubt for all the good that mid 20th century, later 20th century thinkers that try to make it more appealing to people. There's a good in that where you want people to understand it, but there's also, it's a double-edged sword. So I'm thinking, entertainment franchises. When you write books at a popular level that turn into films, not even the best produced films, or if your motivation is to write a book that is going to have a broad appeal and it's driven by marketing, dispensationalism lends itself, because of the eschatological themes, for some entertainment, right? There's some fascinating stuff there about the future, right?
Oh, you're right. You're right. Yeah. No.
Yeah. So it's very easy to take on this sort of other idea, these fanciful ideas, and have liberty and license to how you think it might look when the Antichrist shows up. And now it becomes a whole a game of who he is and what he looks like, where he comes from, and chopping people's heads off for not obeying him. And then you can spin off so many different films and movies and helicopters being locusts and all this stuff, you know, where it's like, it's not that it's untrue, but it's not guarded. And the popular level aspect of dispensationalism, unfortunately, overshadowed the scholarly work of the men like the Walvards and Pentecost and Alva McLean and Charles Ryrie, of course. It took on an entire entertainment culture with fanfare that unfortunately overshadowed the intellectual work and the scholarship that's based on a literal hermeneutic and inductive exegesis. And some of those great minds even fell to it. There are certain books written by a few of the gentlemen I just mentioned, where their publishers perhaps pressured them to write something that's more of a popular level that'll appeal to the great masses, that doesn't have such strong exegesis as perhaps some of their other works. And those, because it gets a wider readership, become known. You do that over decades and decades and decades. Before you know it, we're in a place now where an author like Daniel Hummel can publish The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism through Erdmans. And what he's referring to as the fall of dispensationalism, he is specifically referring to academic scholastic Yeah, there you go, Tommy. He's got the book right there. I do as well. And you know what? Overall, it's a great cultural historical study. I've written a review on it that's actually going to be published sometime soon. But yeah, Tommy's like, well, he'll get a different opinion of it, depending on which angle you're looking at it from, right? But it is a sensation. Look, I mean, just look at the cover that's there. It's very doomsday. It grabs on you. It's like, wow, look how exciting this thing looks. I mean, there's like, you know, like fumes and fire. It looks like a nuclear holocaust happening in the background. And, you know, it's very sensational how the fall of dispensationalism. But he's talking very narrow, specific aspects. Scholastic academic dispensationalism seems to have been so overshadowed by the fanfare and popular versions that he doesn't even know exists anymore, which he does know, because it's actually in the book, Southern California Seminary, as well as others. There's some pockets of schools, at least he acknowledges, who still teach traditional dispensationalism. But the general idea and perspective of the academic community is that dispensationalism has fallen, because all they see when they think of dispensationalism or dispensationalists is the popular lay level fanfare that has, unfortunately, for some of the good that it has to expose people to these themes in the Bible, it's a double-edged sword and has overshadowed any real inductive exegesis that where those themes emerge.
Yeah, no, great answer. And no, I love what you're saying, just simply the overshadow of just the extreme popularity of it. And along those same lines, dispensationalism is also accused of being, we're obsessed with the end times. We're mocked often for, you know, looking at everything and being like, oh, is that the mark of the beast? And trying to interpret, you know, which nations are going to be part of Gog and Magog and all of that stuff. But what I found interesting, and both at the same time reading your book, and then at the same time reading some of my other church history stuff that I'm reading right now. I'm going through the Apostolic Fathers in my own reading as well. And that is, in every generation of the church, until you get to the 20th century, every generation of Christian wrote how they believed they were in the end times. Wycliffe wrote about how he was in the end times. Luther wrote how he was in the end times. Augustine believed that Rome was the restrainer who was taken away, and that was going to, in the fall of Rome, was going to bring about the end times. And then Ignatius, one of the very first writers of the church, wrote about how his days were the end times. And now it seems like dispensationalists are the only ones really putting forward this idea that, you know, Christ could come back tomorrow, and this could be the end of days. Why do you think all the other traditions sort of stopped around this time, and we're the only ones who are doing something that's been common throughout all of church history?
And you know, that's remarkably similar to the parable that Jesus gave, isn't it? About, oh, you know what, a master delays is coming. You know, we don't really even need to worry about his return anymore. I mean, that is exactly. And so then they go out and show themselves a wicked steward. They're not being faithful to that, because it's so easy to forget. You say, man, it's been a while. You know, and of course we hear the ridicule. We hear the ridicule from the world that says the church has been saying this for 2,000 years. The Lord's going to return. The Lord's going to return. You must have gotten it wrong. And eventually the church says, yeah, you know, we're kind of tired of being ridiculed for this. And maybe we did get it wrong. It's been a long time. Let's just move on with our message. Can we come up with something a little more culturally contemporary, relevant? And that's not what we were given to do. That's not the measure of a good steward.
No, great point. I loved you bringing up that parable. It was a good turn there. And thinking of popular sort of lay level dispensationalism that gets mocked a lot, probably no one in my lifetime who is a dispensationalist writer has gotten mocked and put down more than C.I. Scofield. And so I'm assuming that out of our guys here, Tommy, that you would probably know a thing or two about Scofield and what he's written. How do you think Scofield has gotten smeared wrongly over the last 20 to 40 years?
Well, in different areas, the Scofield Bible, as you know, came out in, was it 1907? Yeah, and then it was revised a little bit in 1916, 1917 or something. And then it was the third revision was done, led by John Walrod and people like that in the 60s. But it was so popular in the first 20 years of his existence, it sold over 2 million, and it's purported to have kept Oxford Press, the most prestigious press in the history of the world, from going bankrupt. And
the irony, I love it.
I don't think historically conservative Christianity has smeared him. I think it's as evangelicalism has grown. In the 1970s, they came out, evangelicalism, which started with less than 3 million people in the 1920s in America, had grown to become so dominant. They came out with that book called The Worldly Evangelicals. And so evangelicalism grew so much, and over time, God has no grandchildren. And it gets watered down increasingly. And so, sure, the Scofield Bible needed revising in some areas like the gap theory and some of these other things. But nevertheless, I think it's the so-called evangelical culture that has changed and stuff. And, Ryrie comes out with his that has been almost just as successful. What's happened is liberalism. I remember John Hanna, my church history professor, said that when liberalism dies, dispensationalism will die. Why? Because dispensationalism was set beginning in the 1880s against liberalism. You see, that's why it spread, for example, in the 1920s within Pentecostalism, because they were fighting liberals. And so he was right. So-called progressive dispensationalism came in because they wanted to change and update, become, and that's always the motive, is to, make something more relevant to the culture in which you live, rather than restating what you believe is that and interacting with the culture. But nevertheless, I think dispensationalism died out because you have all these Bible colleges and seminaries. At one time, every major city, metropolitan area had a Bible college. They were all dispensational. They all had their Scofield Bibles, all of that kind of stuff. And now most of them have abandoned it, as they become more sophisticated and all of that kind of stuff. And so they get all the guys with the PhDs who went over to Europe and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's just been an overall decline. I don't think dispensationalism is any less reasonable. And I'm talking about what I call traditional dispensationalism. By the way, Ryrie says it's consistent literal interpretation, which produces a distinction between Israel and the church, which results in the glory of God. That's his three sine qua non. And he was about to put out his book on dispensationalism today, back in the 60s, when he was leaving the DTS, the Dallas Seminary faculty room, and S. Lewis Johnson asked him, what are the essentials of dispensationalism? And on the spot, that's where he came up with it. And, gave that comment and put it in the book. But the fact is before that, you didn't have a consistent application. You have historicism dominating premillennialism. By the way, the Puritans were premillennial up until Jonathan Edwards in the 1730s, but they were historicist premillennialists. So many of the older premillennialists were historicist and not futurist. And so dispensationalism developed as a consistent application of futurism, within premillennialism, and dispensationalism is just as reliant on its ecclesiology. Walvoord has always emphasized that as much as eschatology. And because the church is distinct from Israel, then that produces a certain eschatology, you see.
We talked about Scofield for a minute, and let's talk about the other sort of often mocked dispensationalist, and that is the granddaddy, Darby. How do you think dispensationalism today, and maybe James, you could probably speak on this the best, where do you think modern dispensationalism disagrees with Darby the most today, or maybe thinking of the golden era back in the 70s? Where have we moved the most away from Darby?
Okay, yeah, that's a big question, and I guess I would have to say Darby was much less concerned with successive dispensations, as we see in Scofield's and every other iteration of a dispensational scheme, including those centuries before him, Pierre Poiret and all the early John Edwards, all provided 7 dispensation schemes. Darby did not. He was an outlier. He was not the originator of that concept at all. He had a very different concept, which even allowed for overlapping dispensations, concentric dispensations. He didn't view the church as a dispensation, but he did regard a dispensation of the nations or the Gentiles with Babylon and the image. And so he had a very different concept of dispensations in the sense of he wasn't looking for, how do we divide up history, but rather how do we understand God's organization of the peoples that he has bestowed stewardship to and has expectations according to his revelation. And then of course that the paramount issue for Darby is man's failure, man's inability to meet God's standard. And so therefore the ruin of all dispensations is also a very important theme. So I would say modern dispensationalism in some ways has more of this optimistic view. Obviously not a-mill, post-mill. Eschatologically, there's the dispensation will end in ruin, but the apostasy is usually something external to the church. I think most dispensationalists today look for the apostasy in the world around us. Like, boy, the world's going to sure grow cold, and the love of many will, it'll sure be a very hostile environment. Don't we see that in the world all around us? Let's form our holy huddle and wait for the Lord's return. But that is not what the New Testament says. Within the church, apostasy will come. So, Ryrie really saw the church as in a state of ruin, and that its failure is really no different from, say, Israel's failure, or any other dispensation. Although again, he differed on his defining of the church as a dispensation.
You mean Darby, right? You said Ryrie.
Darby. I'm sorry, Darby.
Right.
So the idea is simply that the failure and the inability of man to achieve God's end. Culminating, of course, in the dispensation of the fullness of times. Christ is the one who achieves God's end. He singularly can. He's the only one able, and he will. In the dispensation in the age to come, he will fulfill all things in Christ. He will head up all things. All the dispensations will come to a head in Christ and his kingship and his ruling over all the nations and over Israel. And so this is there are areas of commonality, and of course, as we can see, also some pretty big areas of distinction among Darby's view of the dispensations and what's popular today.
So Darby's about as far from post-millennialism as you could possibly be, like even more so than amillennialism, because post-millennialism is the success of the church, and then Christ comes, and Darby would be that's impossible.
Right.
Darby was once a postmillennialist.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I guess would he have been a cage stage premillennialist? Is that because he would have left postmillennialism and then started a whole new system?
When he came to the United States, he called D.L. Moody an idiot. You know, he looked down on the intellectual state of most evangelicals. But Moody adopted dispensationalism, but the Americans did not tend to accept the separationism that you had within the British Brethren movement. You see, that came a little later when the Brethren movement came in, but they loved his and they Americanized it into, you know, what we believe. And Darby spoke 7 times, starting in the 1870s after the Civil War, you know, mainly in the North and in Canada. And but he felt that he had failed in his lectures, you know, but he led James Hall Brooks, that Princeton Presbyterian in St. Louis, who had ended up having the largest church in St. Louis at the time, you know, who became the great advocate of American dispensationalism and pre-tribulationalism.
So I find a lot of stuff with Darby to be fascinating, and I've never read Darby before myself because I hear comments about how reading Darby is like both wonderful and torture at the same time. And so I was wondering if you guys, if I were to read or somebody to pick one Darby book to read, what would you say would be the starting place for somebody to read Darby himself?
So Darby's synopsis is probably, I mean, it's not going to get you into the theology, you know, and it's not, the hopes of the Church of God is where Darby, through a series of lectures, presented dispensationalism, if you were looking for that theology specifically. But his synopsis of the books of the Bible, it's a 5-volume set. It was actually prepared for publication. The synopsis is actually, it's probably the most available. It's a 5-volume set, Genesis through Revelation, organized, you know, sort of like a commentary, but it's not a verse by verse. But it's, you know, it is brilliant, and it is a classic work that many would refer to. And, you know, it's not theologically driven; it's text driven. So, you know, even those who do not align with dispensational theology, don't identify with that, I think still could benefit tremendously from Darby's synopsis.
So I ask for one book to introduce me to Darby, and you give me a 5-volume.
Yeah, that's how Darby works.
Appreciate that. Appreciate how that
works. I've got all of Darby's works, and it's 6 feet long.
You got one to recommend, Tommy? Do you got one that
No, I don't.
I could recommend this for somebody interested in entering Darby's thought. The best way to do it.
That's what I'm looking for.
Okay.
Yeah.
Roy Huebner is the way to do it. Not Darby, but read Roy Huebner. Huebner understood Darby's thought, and he organized it, and he actually piecemeals it together from its disparate places. So Huebner, he's passed now, but he was very faithful to Darby's ideas. In fact, you know, hagiographically so. I mean, he just champions for Darby, and Darby can do no wrong. So it's not a critical engagement with Darby, but it is absolutely what he's expressing is Darby's ideas, and he does it much, much better and more succinctly than Darby does. And he fills it with Darby. So if you were to read Roy Huebner, you'd be reading 80+% Darby with a little William Kelly and just a splice of his own commentary.
If I can jump in here, I'm going to put an end to this chaos here, this conversation right here. So I got the book, Darby himself, Where You Should Start. This is my humble opinion, of course. The Nature and Unity of the Church of Christ. That is something that Darby, probably his first major work from what I remember, around 1828. Tommy said something very interesting, and it's true. Like, Darby's hard to enter because he developed in his thought. So it's like, what part of Darby are you reading? So a lot of people don't know this about Darby, about how voluminous of a writer he was. 34 or 36 volumes of his collected writings, right? Then you
that's only 80% of it.
Right, yeah, exactly. Then you got a 5-volume synopsis of the Bible that James mentioned. That's 5. Then you got a 7-volume notes and comments. Then a 2-volume jots and tittles. Then he also wrote hymns. He's got over 24 hymns. A lot of people don't know Darby was a hymn writer. And then he's got personal letters, like who knows how many, those are. And of course, he also translated the Bible from the Greek and Hebrew into English and German and possibly Dutch as well. I mean, the guy was so brilliant, and who can contain his thoughts? So, and it seems like every thought he had, he just, kind of vomited on a page, So you get these long concatenated phrases, parenthetical statements within parenthetical statements. Anyways, so entering Darby's thought. Now, I'm not an expert on Darby. Both James and Tommy certainly are, and one of our other contributors, Max Wormchuck, who wrote the chapter on Darby, would be a good place to consult as well. His book on John Nelson Darby. So he is going to, from what I remember of that writing, really emphasize the independence of being believers in Christ and united around the gospel, and not a state church or denomination. Where the reformers, they championed so well the soteriological doctrines that we hold so dear in Protestantism, justification by faith alone, for example. That was probably the big staple one. They're in ecclesiology. What they did, although they got the remnant of believers out from under the shackles of the Roman Catholic Church, but ecclesiologically, they just started national churches of their own, right? Whether it's the Church of Scotland or the Church of England or even the Church of Ireland. So, anyways, you got these reformers now having church denominational traditions and nationalism based on their movements. Darby comes along in nature and unity of the church and saying, "Listen, we're united around the gospel and the brotherhood of being a saint and the believer of Christ and the breaking of bread, and it doesn't take an ordained clergy to be able to have to do that for us." So I think the nature and the unity of the Church of Christ, that's the whole title, I believe, usually referred to as the nature and unity of the church, is a good place to enter Darby's thoughts from Darby himself.
That was a good answer. You made me want to read it after that, uniting around the gospel line. That was good. So, all right. So the one thing I thought was kind of most interesting about this book is that you guys had contributions from the mid-acts people and the progressive dispensational, and you allowed them to speak for themselves. So it wasn't like, we're not mid-acts, so let me tell you guys about all the terrible things about mid-acts. And we're not progressive, let me tell you about all the terrible things of progressive. You sort of let them speak for themselves and contribute to where their spot are. So I'd like to talk about them for a couple of minutes. So the first question is mid-acts, which for my whole life, if anything I know about mid-acts, it's just people dumping on mid-acts and talking about how awful it is. What would you guys say would be the way that mid-acts benefited dispensationalism as a whole the most?
That's an interesting question. As we say in the book, when we summarize the main ideas, at least in the last chapter, one thing from what I remember in the chart for mid-acts, which is also referred to as grace theology, Ryrie and others would refer to it as hyper-dispensationalism or ultra-dispensationalism, but mid-acts is what they generally refer to themselves as. The positive attribute of mid-acts dispensationalism and contribution dispensational thought is they see distinctions within the scriptures that most of us would just gloss right over. Whether those distinctions are worth emphasizing or where they go with them, that's another conversation. But they do see distinctions that most people do not. And so I've benefited myself from some mid-acts works. For example, Charles Baker had a dispensational systematic theology. And although much of it I would be like, nah, I think he's gone too far here, he has such a careful, sharp eye. And by the way, Charles Baker was one of Louis Berry Chafer's most prized own students and highly recommended him.
Yeah. He was a Dallas grad.
He sure was. Yeah. And he's able to see, as other mid-acts scholars, distinctions in the text that most of us gloss over. So to your point, Shawn, we had firsthand representation. This wasn't an apologetic for these traditions. So we invited Phil Long, teaching at Grace Christian University. He's the editor of the Journal of Grace Theology. And when you read his chapter, he's not arguing to, hey, this is what's true. He's just giving a firsthand representation of what we believe. Not even shying away from the controversial doctrines. For example, the Lord's Supper may not, according to mid-acts position, be applicable to Christians, and certainly baptism. They're going to have a problem with water baptism not being a Christian rite, as we as normal Protestants or other dispensationalists would say, of course it is. They would say, no, Paul didn't baptize anybody. It was, and we're going to police that, or at least it wasn't commanding anybody to baptize anybody. That's something from Jesus and a more Jewish flavor, for, if you will, while the church was just beginning to start. So, that's where it becomes very controversial. But it's interesting conversations to have because it's based on from how they're applying a literal hermeneutic, and that's what I like about it. It's very hermeneutically driven, maybe not as they go a little too far with certain things, but they contribute a certain application of the literal hermeneutic that just exposes distinctions in the text that we would normally gloss over.
Well, I would argue that just as dispensationalism is declining, mid-Acts stuff is really declining as far as acceptability and popularity
area. But I'll say this: I live in Southern California, and my church, Revolved Bible Church, is in San Juan Capistrano, and we've actually had people show up at our church that are from a Bereans ministry, which is part of a mid-Acts tradition. So there are pockets of them, even here on the left coast. They're not popular at all, but they are around. But
Southern California has everything.
That's right. Everything under the sun. You're right. Not too much of a surprise there, right?
So that's a positive. They help us look into distinctions in the text. And can we get what would you say would probably be the negative of mid-Acts for the movement overall? James, you wanna?
It's just wrong.
I'll say this. There's always a balance that needs to be struck in it, and scriptures need to be taken in the totality of what they express. And the distinctions are essential, and everything that can help call our attention to the distinctions is commendable. But the distinctions do not minimize the similarities or the continuity. So you can't simply say, hey, we have a distinction here, so therefore everything that preceded this we can dispense with, and so I think that there is a overreaction or making too much of those distinctions. It's one thing to recognize a distinction. It's another thing to draw conclusions based on those distinctions. The question is, are the distinctions worth recognizing? Yes. What conclusions do we draw from that? Then that needs to be discussed. There needs to be healthy, robust discussion. I think there is a tendency among Christians, and now I'm talking about much more of the covenantal variety, but just by and large evangelical Christians, to minimize the distinctions, to turn a blind eye to it, and to simply look at the similarities, to look for the continuity. And that doesn't really do us much favors. But at the same time, to make too much of it is you can wreck in that ditch as well.
Yeah, and so we just talked about mid-Acts. Let's have the same discussion for progressive dispensationalism. What is the best overall benefit dispensationalism as a whole has had as a result of the work of progressive dispensationalists?
If I can, I'll start this. This is a little bit of I don't want to go into a rabbit trail here, but our book is very unique in the fact that you have, say, a first-hand representation from mid-Acts dispensationalism with Philip Long. You have Tommy Ice representing traditional dispensationalism, who's got a long pedigree of scholarship behind that. And then you have Darrell Bach representing progressive dispensationalism, who was one of the pioneers of the movement. To your question, and I don't know another work that has that, by the way. And by the way, Tommy, I don't even know if you knew that these other guys were on the book. We didn't know if you would be on it if they were. So there you go. So we didn't tell everybody, all the individual authors who were on it. Surprise. But for progressive dispensationalism, they have where traditional dispensationalism, at least the themes from that traditional dispensationalism would be best known for, whether it's a pre-trib rapture or a distinction church in Israel, or premillennial return of Christ, which of course dispensationalism doesn't hold the monopoly to that, but that is our eschatological view of the premillennial return of Christ. And it has become very popular in fanfare in movies and video games and all these. I mean, there's like the rapture clock of people. I saw a pet sitting ministry somewhere where they are hiring atheists to take care of your pets when the rapture happens for a small fee of $20 a month. I mean, it's ridiculous what this is on, right? It is absolutely ridiculous. Yeah, this is true. And but progressive dispensationalism, they have given sort of a scholar. They've made inroads of scholarship where sort of I don't know if the right way to say it, the ball was dropped with traditionalists, but it just became overshadowed by the fanfare. Progressive dispensationalism is doing a lot of work with this scholarship, and a guy like Darrell Bach, He's heading a cultural center at Dallas Seminary. He's not just, a lot of progressives are not stuck on just dispensationalism. They're doing scholarship in New Testament studies and critical works and grammatical types of works as well, and historical critical works, and having a voice in that. And so, for it's a good thing that it's when we can say, well, dispensationalism certainly didn't die with Ryrie and Walvoord. It's continued on in these other thinkers, to the point where, again, to go back to Dan Hamel's Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism, him and I have had personal conversations over our book and his. And he's admitted very frankly, with integrity, he didn't interact with a lot of progressives, because maybe in a sense, and he didn't say this, it's my own idea, maybe it would ruin his thesis a little bit, because academic dispensationalism hasn't fallen. It's taken on this new crop of people, if you will, that are making inroads in all fields within biblical studies. But I will say that as traditional dispensationalists, what I am, and we're not making a case for any of these movements, but just what they are, we have our scholarship as well, and we're doing it as well. And there are peer-reviewed journals that are from that tradition. They're just not getting given a fair hearing like the others are. But progressives, and I think it's a good thing, they are making inroads in all areas of theology and biblical studies, even where we disagree with them, whatever. But at least they are not shying away from being under the dispensational umbrella, if you will.
So that's a good positive for progressive dispensationalism. Tommy, you want to tell me a negative about progressive dispensationalism?
Here we go.
I don't believe they're within the fold of dispensationalism.
There we go.
If Ryrie is correct in his definition, because they merge Israel and the church, basically, there's a book called Issues in Dispensationalism edited by Charles Ryrie, and I have a chapter in there, and I document how Darrell and others violated the Dallas Seminary doctrinal statement.
Tommy, would you say that perhaps I remember what reading Ryrie as well, based on hermeneutics, their complementary hermeneutics is something that might take them out of what you consider the dispensational.
Complementary hermeneutics is a theological belief, not a hermeneutic.
I just had to poke the bear. That's all I had to do.
Yeah. Well, it is. It brings in theological beliefs into what historically should be hermeneutics, or your process or method. And not that you can totally make that void, but because it's deduced from Scripture itself. But nevertheless, I don't agree with them hermeneutically. I don't agree with their conclusions theologically. Darrell and Craig Blazing, they're the two Dallas guys that I've spent hours and hours talking with both of them over, especially in the 90s when this stuff came out. They both strongly believe in the preacher of rapture. Darrell is very strong on that. So is Craig Blazing. And let's see what else. And they're strongly premillennialists. Now, what you have is as people who call themselves progressive dispensationalism, most of them are abandoning pre-tribulationalism today and everything. So it destroys that distinction between Israel and the church, the historic distinction that leads to not seeing the preacher of rapture, for example, is just one area.
So I guess you would say, Tommy, that their blurring of Israel and the church is just, you think it will inevitably, erode all the other dispensational distinctives over time.
Well, whether it does or doesn't, that's enough.
Yeah, that's true. I guess that's a good point.
And I believe this is part of the problem of any kind of a reductionistic approach to dispensationalism. To make it, merely an eschatological issue, you can say, well, then it looks like the progressives are in the same camp because we share an eschatology, sort of at least a futuristic expectation. But the problem already occurred with the reductionism of dispensationalism into simply an eschatological, a futurist perspective. Right. If that's why I think it's important to get down again to the issue. And I think progressive dispensationalism has even further eroded the distinctives of dispensationalism. And I think that's damaging.
Yeah.
I'd like to redefine the line and reclaim those distinctives, because the peoples of God. I mean, when you talk about progressive dispensationalisms dealing with the new covenant, with the Davidic kingdom, I mean, all of these things, they all end up being almost amorphous, and it blurs, and it's hard to define where one ends and another begins. And does it really even matter? I mean, it end up the attitude. And so it is, again, I think it's swinging the pendulum the other direction from the mid-Acts guys to making too much of every distinctive to, well, let's just get rid of most of these distinctives and hold on to a few core essentials. And that's not, we're not at liberty. I mean, we must receive revelation that God is revealed, and we are responsible for how we deal with every bit of that revelation. We can't just make much of major on some issues and minor on others, and make others non-essential or secondary or things like that. I mean, we need to deal with the whole counsel of God. And I think the distinctions are every bit as important as the similarities, and we need to address all of them and not just kind of sweep with too broad of a brush.
Yeah, the progressives' main departures in the area of ecclesiology, not in eschatology. Originally, but it's their wrong definition of the church.
I love that we just had this discussion, because I think this goes back to the first question, though, of what are dispensational ideas that you guys are tracking, because it helps to show that while, Tommy's going to say, I look at progressive dispensationalists, and I'm going to say, I don't even think they should be in the dispensational.
By the way, I first bought into it initially.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, really?
Yes, and I had.
Well, this is like the first time this admission's been done, probably.
Well,
it's going to be worse.
I had a discussion at ETS in San Francisco, wherever that was, I think in the it was the 90s, with Robert Thomas from Masters Seminary, who I think he was at the time before Masters Seminary ever started. But and he was the one that saw this kind of stuff. He's been the most rigorous against progressive dispensationalism of just about anybody out there. Of course, he's long gone, but nevertheless.
Left behind a great commentary on Revelation.
Right.
So again, going back to how this relates to the whole book, like we would say, we might not even categorize, at least, Tommy's explicitly saying he wouldn't categorize a progressive dispensationalist as a dispensationalist, but we can still look at them and say, here are all these dispensational ideas that they still hold to, that we would say, fit in the dispensationalist, overall framework. So
what are those ideas?
Well, pre-tribulational rapture, premillennial future, futuristic. So we can label all those.
Dying on the vine, but
So my point is, we can see all those ideas, even if you wouldn't say that group is necessarily dispensational. And what this book does is it looks at all those ideas throughout church history that have always been there, even if those individuals wouldn't have all the characteristics of a dispensationalist. And so I think that's really the great point of this book. And I think for me at least, I think I'm going to read church history a little different now. So because I'm reading the Apostolic Fathers, and when I'm going through the Epistle of Barnabas, there's a couple of times where I'm reading stuff and I'm like, that's a dispensational idea. I wouldn't say that letter was a dispensationalist letter, but now I'm keyed in a little bit more to be able to recognize, okay, this author is seeing a clear distinction between Israel and the church in his writing. And you can see that he's putting them up as two different things. That's a dispensational idea, even though he's not a dispensationalist. And that's what this book does.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, because one thing that these controversial areas are within one group of the geography and of time. It's when we get to American dispensationalism, these ideas start becoming unfolding in kind of unexpected ways or exciting ways, or however we want to describe it. The book is broken down in three parts, right? Of dispensational thought in ancient Mediterranean, and how it moved to vintage Europe, and then into America. And when you get into America, that's when we have subtitles to each one of these essays, because now it's different. So think about what we're discussing here. This is what's fascinating about the book. And as editors, sometimes it's very hard not to try to be a neutral observer and just edit the essays, as opposed to trying to make it argumentative from one tradition or the other. But Think of the difference between mid-acts and progressive dispensationalism. As many people say, progressive dispensationalism may not qualify as a dispensational, to be dispensationalism. They would also say the same thing as mid-acts, perhaps. Right. But look at the difference. You got progressive dispensationalism, who would say, who some would say shouldn't be considered dispensational because dispensationalism at its root level is a consistent grammatical historical hermeneutic. They're using a complementary hermeneutic, taking the New Testament to complement the Old Testament to reinterpret meanings, but their positions are still somewhat similar: pre-trib rapture, premillennial Christ, which are dispensational themes. Then you got mid-acts, where the hermeneutic is so good, it's too good because it's consistent all the way through and becoming literalistic, perhaps, seeing distinctions. So the hermeneutic is good in a sense, but the positions become aberrant, or different. Also, now baptism doesn't refer to, aren't applicable to Christians, or the Lord's table might not be, considering based on which mid-acts dispensationalist. So it's very interesting when you get the dispensational thought within America, because that's where these things branch off. It's not before then, but now all these things come together, and now you have a good hermeneutic that ends up in some different doctrines, or you have a questionable hermeneutic that maintains some good doctrines. But it's all, at least academically, under this dispensational umbrella. And then within our tradition, within the house, we can have our infighting of what's more consistently dispensational, what's not.
Yeah, dispensationalism was never accepted in any of the British universities. As they have the Brethren archives, Manchester, and this huge collection. I've been there of Brethren writings. Well, all the Brethren, they had differences. All the Brethren weren't pre-trib, for example. Most of them were. Or you have people that were considered Brethren for 1 month. And shift away and all that kind of stuff. But Europe is different from the United States, as you were saying.
Yes. Of course, yeah.
So when I did the interview with Forge from Reformation, one of my favorite questions was asking who your Mount Rushmore was for overall church history with the Reformation and how influential it's been today, on all of church history as a whole. So I want to narrow down a Mount Rushmore a little bit more and say, who would be your Mount Rushmore of dispensationalism? That would be the 4 most influential dispensationalists on the movement overall. So take a non-religious category of an easy Mount Rushmore. My Mount Rushmore of New York Yankees of all time is Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Joe DiMaggio, Mickey Mantle. That's the world's easiest Mount Rushmore. You definitely know who the 4 greatest Yankees are. Those guys are, head and shoulders above everybody else. So then my question is, who would be your 4 most influential dispensationalists? So I think a couple of them have to be there and obvious, but I'd be curious who you guys would have as your top 4. And James, I'm going to ask you to go first. Who's your Mount Rushmore of dispensationalism?
Well, I'd start with the Apostle Paul.
I thought you were going to say Jesus. I mean,
that's what I was going to go for.
That was really good.
No. I mean, and I don't say that tongue in cheek in any way. I mean, I'm sure Peter, when Paul was withstanding him to his face, and James, and all he was having to do with Galatians, and the grace and law, and how much he talks about Peter to the circumcision and I to the uncircumcision. I mean, his language was dripping with dispensationalism. Okay, he saw the Christian world within a dispensational framework, and unlike any other. I mean, I would certainly put him apart from all the other apostles in his clarity of dispensational thought, and it's where we see it most distinctly in the New Testament. I mean, we don't go to Jesus for theological dispensationalism. I use his parables because we understand cultural nature of what a dispensation is, but Paul applies it theologically like none other, and it is dripping in his epistles, and it's just apparent in his thoughts. So it is Paul is absolutely number 1. then going from the ancient Mediterranean, I think we'd go maybe continental Europe with Pierre Poiret. The French, his development, he probably wrote more on dispensational arrangement of history, philosophically speaking, a Christian kind of mystic, and his approach to the succession of history and the amount at which he addressed just that subject is significant, not just for its time, but I mean, he really developed it. Much of it's not translated into English, so we don't benefit, the English-speaking world doesn't benefit from it as much. But, I think he needs to be on there because he's centuries before Darby. Obviously, Darby, you get to the British Isles, Darby's got to be on there. And probably did more for the English-speaking world than anyone else. And then after Darby, I would say Lewis Sperry Chafer once you get to North America, because and I know that glosses over Scofield, but I think the lasting impact of Chafer in establishing Dallas Seminary probably had a bigger impact and a more lasting impact, even maybe a mushroom impact with Scofield Reference Bible for his day. But the fact that, what we've seen over the last few centuries in the staying power of dispensationalism is, I would attribute it to Lewis Sperry Chafer. And of course, his systematic theology. There's never been anything on that volume since, to this present day, for a dispensational systematic theology.
All right. Okay. That is not a lot of overlap with my list. Okay. Tommy, do you have a top four most influential dispensationalists?
Yeah, I got Darby, James Hall Brooks, Scofield, and Charles Ryrie.
Okay, that's more like my list. Okay, so Ryrie, Darby, Brooks, Scofield. That's not a lot of people going to argue with that list.
Even though I wrote my master's thesis on Lewis Sperry Chafer, his view of original sin, though, but.
All right, Cory.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's obvious. I mean, we're all here. I would list Shawn, Cory Marsh, Tommy Ice, and James Fazio as the Mount Rushmore of. No, I would have to start with Mount Rushmore of dispensationalism. Let's start with Darrell Bach. Look at Tommy. I just want to see his head explode. That's all. All right.
Yeah, it must have deteriorated very fast.
No, in all seriousness, I wasn't expecting this question. I didn't know the questions ahead of time, so I haven't had a chance to really think this out. But I mean, apart from the biblical writers, come on, James went to Paul. It's like, okay, let's get Paul on there. Let's, of course. And Jesus before him, because of his use of oikonomia and the parables and what he meant by that, being a steward and being accountable to that stewardship. But I guess, Darby is obvious. He's the godfather of modern dispensational thought in so many different ways. He didn't invent the system. He didn't create things out of thin air at all. But his impact was obviously huge. So I would start with that area of vintage Europe. But before him, I wish I had the chapter in front of me and the names, but Mark Snowberger's chapter on the pre-Darby era, that little thin sliver between 1600 and 1800, he dug up some wonderful primary sources of names that I hadn't heard of that have some very clear distinctions of a future for Israel within the Puritan times. These were Puritans that totally were what we would call Zionists today. They saw an importance for the land. You cannot detach the Jewish people from their land that was promised to them, and saw a future restoration. Now, some of them would have thought maybe it's not as neatly packaged today or distinct as we would make. Someone would see Israel within the church, but still a subsection where they were distinct.
In general, one of your heads would represent 18th century Puritans.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think they deserve a place, and Snowberger does a wonderful contribution to make that known. So Darby, some of the guys from the Puritan eras that were Zionists in that sense. In America, see, I'm an American, so of course I'm going to be influenced by American dispensational thought. Chafer was, as was mentioned already. Sorry, I'm flipping my computer there. Almost took a spill, took a dive. Chafer is huge for academic dispensationalism because the establishment of Dallas. Alva McLean. I was big with Alva McLean. I loved his thought. You got a difference between Dallas and Grace. He founded Grace Theological Seminary, and then you got sort of this where Dallas may have been more Keswick, or maybe that was Grace. I forgot which one was more.
Dallas was more into Keswick. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And Grace is more Brethren. And so he has his book, The Greatness of the Kingdom. It's still one of the
that's
best,
a great book.
It is one of the best books ever on what it is the kingdom of God and the future mediatorial kingdom. Michael Vlock's book, He Will Reign, is really an expansion of that book. And Vlock is first to admit, like, so much of this is a development of, or his own being influenced by McLean's a book on the kingdom, The Greatness of the Kingdom. So there you go. Darby, some Puritans, Oliver McLean, and then I'll put Charles Ryrie on there.
Let me just say this. If up until he died suddenly a couple of years ago, William Watson has done all this history of dispensationalism and pre-tribulationism, and he's spoken 4 or 5 times. If you go to our website, pre-trib.org, we have the last 17 years on video of our pre-trib study groups. Mm-hmm. And William Watson has shown all of these guys all the way back to the late 1500s, early 1600s and stuff, and done a lot of work on the eschatology and stuff. And he's come up with a number of dispensationalists during, it starts with the Reformation, basically.
Yeah, I mean, no offense to any of you guys, but Watson's chapter was the one I was looking forward to the most when I read this book. So
Watson, we were very honored. Absolutely, we were very honored to have him, because as far as we know, this was Bill's last published writing.
He just dropped dead.
He did.
Suddenly.
He was going to come. Tommy, you might remember this a couple years ago. Watson, myself, and James were all speaking at the Pre-Trib Research Center at the annual conference during COVID.
They merged together. 32 years merges together with me.
Right, I understand completely. Yeah, but Watson, him and I were talking. He was so excited. He had his plane tickets. He's ready to go. And then he had passed a month before the conference, maybe 2 months. And so H. Wayne House stood up and read his very rough draft of his chapter, what became our chapter in the book. But William Watson's done some great work, and it's funny we're bringing him up because he's also got a lot of critique, a lot of pushback from those who would say that he's misinterpreting some of these passages, and these aren't so clearly pre-trib. These are more mid-trib or even post-trib, but he's forcing a pre-trib grid on it. What it's doing is causing a discussion, at least, which is nice. So it's, even if I would disagree with those assessments, of course I would, because I was the editor of the book. It is his chapter, Shawn, as you bring it up. It's more, if it's not the best, it's certainly one of the most interesting, and because the time period of dispensational.
It's the most fascinating chapter. Yeah, because you would expect to find none, and so that's what's fascinating.
Yeah, well, he gradates them. He doesn't put them all as this is a clear slam dunk pre-trib. He has a spectrum.
He does, and he's honest enough to say what we would call, now we're using anachronistic terms of pre-trib rapture or mid-trib pre-rap, but he's saying that these are evenly dispersed among these, and which includes the pre-trib rapture. The problem is when others, the Reformed folk or the anti-rapture people, would say that there's no pre-trib rapture. Right. That's ridiculous, but they'll accept these other rapture positions being in that period, just not agreeing with them. You can't just dismiss the pre-trib position. It's certainly there, included among the others that we would describe as pre-rap, mid-trib, or post-trib. Pre-trib was certainly there with an imminent rapture position, and Watson does a pretty fine job, detailing that in that chapter, I believe.
And you know what? I just want to clarify one thing. I don't think it is the last thing that Dr. Watson wrote. I know that the dispensationalism before Darby deals with the 17th and 18th century predecessors. I know that he wrote a full, complete manuscript, which he actually did turn into H. Wayne House. Right. But before he passed, that deals with the 15th and 16th centuries as well. Mm. And that was the reason why when we approached him to deal with the Middle Ages, he was very enthusiastic. And he said, I just completed a manuscript on the 15th and 16th century forerunners. And I would love to go all the way back to the Middle Ages and deal with everything from, the 7th, 8th century, something like that, all the way through up to the 15th century.
But what? He had already completed that, from what I understand.
He had already completed that. So this was the last thing that he wrote to our knowledge. However, there remains a manuscript out there. It's now with his his wife, actually, because, so I don't know that it is being prepared for publication and that it's being edited or anything like that. But as I understand it, H. Wayne House wanted to respect his wife's wishes in terms of what she'd want to do with it for publication. So it may or may not come out with his publishing house, with Wayne House's Lampion. But nevertheless, I certainly hope it sees the light of day, because it represents a tremendous amount of work.
We thank him for his contribution, and he sort of gets an honorary asterisk in everybody's Mount Rushmores. And mine at the end, my Mount Rushmore would be Darby, Scofield, Ryrie, and then probably a lot of dispensationalists would hate it, but I feel like Tim LaHaye should be on one of the Mount Rushmores, because he just had an outsized popular influence on dispensationalism. So it's hard to go into a Goodwill and not find Tim LaHaye on one of the shelves.
Right.
So.
I worked for him for 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
He's the one that sponsored the pre-trib study group and research center, paid my salary for many years.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess not a lot of pushback should come.
No,
from,
didn't have much money. Just kidding.
Well, we can all Tim LaHaye is sort of an orbit,
right?
Kind of orbit around him. So
Southern California.
and Tommy has such a professional, history with him and co-authoring books, and then the Pre-Trib Research Center and founding that at Southern California Seminary. Tim LaHaye founded Christian Heritage College, which is San Diego Christian College, our sister school, if you will, of an undergrad school, and he was a huge supporter of Southern California Seminary. I actually have Tim LaHaye's personal Bible with all his notes, handwritten notes before he wrote any of the Left Behind series or any of his stuff. I have all his actual hand, with ink and everything. It's a wonderful possession that we have. I have in my office under lock and key, if you will. But every once in a while, I'll flip open to see what he had to say on a certain passage before I consult any works, just to see what his thoughts were on it.
I have over 100 books from his library.
So okay, so I don't even feel bad. I thought I might get some how could you do that pop level, but man, this Left Behind series for how much?
I'll say that after we stop the interview.
My Reconstructionist friends complain that pre-tribulationism was dying, and then Tim LaHaye comes along with Left Behind series,
Yeah.
And oh well.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for spending this time on Rev Reads. Again, the book is Discovering Dispensationalism. We have our editors here, Cory Marsh, James Fazio, one of the great contributors, Tommy Ice. I loved this book. I learned a whole lot from it. I'm glad to have read it. And so I hope that if you've not had a chance to pick up a copy of this book, you'll pick one up. And Cory, it's a nice book. Like it looks good. Like it's attractive.
It looks good. You know what?
You could have a mushroom cloud. You could have a mushroom cloud in the middle, which would help drive some more sales. But
right. I'll tell you what, Shawn. You know what? You have something. I saw something of an interview you did about a book, The Spine, and having a nice title on the spine.
Oh yeah,
like big enough spine.
No, it's a good spine.
So we actually, I thought about that, because the spine, the Discovering Dispensationalism title was smaller, and myself and Fazio's name were small. And I'm like, let's make it a little bit bigger, because you're right. Most books, just like Behind All of Us, you're seeing the spine. So let's see that title there. So there's a little insight behind the cover image of this. We wanted the spine to look very professional, and the whole cover image as well, and very studious. So hopefully we achieved that.
No, I never appreciated book spines until I had the YouTube channel, and I was all of a sudden, I wanted the books I'd reviewed to be put on the back, and I'm definitely noticing when, you can't read the titles of the book on the spine. So I appreciate the work that you guys did. It's good craftsmanship.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that.
All right. So thank you guys for coming on to Rev Reads. I appreciate it. And if you've made it all the way to the end and you have not subscribed to the channel, I would love for you to subscribe to Rev Reads to be part of the community we have with our regular book reviews. I have a lineup too of great author interviews that will be coming down the pike in the next couple of months, and I would love you to be a part of those. So thank you so much for viewing this interview, for watching this interview, and again, thank you so much, Cory and James and Tommy. I appreciate your time.
We'll see you here, there, or in the air.
All right. Hopefully the air.
Thank you, Shawn.
All right.
Amen.